Okay, hey, we're going to hit chapter 12 real quick and get through that. So, when we're talking about chapter 12, we're going to look at um, the antebellum South and slavery. Basically, we're looking at slavery in the South. Antebellum is a word that refers to the years before the Civil War. And so, this would be the South before the Civil War, right? Really, mostly though, it's going to look at antebellum is really going to look at that time period from roughly 1800 to 1860, right? That 60-year period in which cotton is absolutely is king. It's the most important product that's produced in America. It fuels America's rise to the top or rise to international prominence. It fuels America's factories in the North. It allows for the South to grow, right? And what really is going to kickstart all of this is in 1783, Eli Whitney is going to invent the cotton gin, which I believe we talked about in an earlier chapter. And he's going to invent the cotton gin, which makes the de-seeding of cotton much quicker, right? Before 1793, cotton was not a moneymaker for farmers. Like it took an adult male an entire day's worth of effort to clean a pound full of cotton. Um, After the invention of the cotton gin, um, they could clean somewhere in the neighborhood of 100 pounds, 50 to 100 pounds, right? And then as cotton gins get bigger, they're going to be able to produce and clean much more than that. So by 1860, over two-thirds of the world's cotton is going to come from the American South, and that's going to be fueled by slave labor. Okay. Southern cotton planters would support the growth of the textile industry in the North, as well as in England. And so, um, cotton from the American South is getting shipped everywhere in the world. It's going to England, it's going to France, it's going to Germany, it's going to the American North, and all of those people are making money on it. So it's unfair to say that the South, was the only place that was involved in slavery because all of those places were involved in slavery as well in some way, shape, or form. Okay. Um, Before the invention of the cotton gin, like we said, cotton production was almost non-existent. And by the end of the War of 1812, America had begun to industrialize to keep pace not only with Britain in the textile industry. Cotton replaces wool, and England hops on cotton as a way. Cotton becomes the main cash crop in the American South. We transition from sugar and tobacco and indigo and even rice to focusing primarily on cotton. Um, as the 1800s progress, we need more and more land for cotton, and so you see the displacement of Native Americans through the American through the Andrew Jackson Indian Removal Act, and we see the growth of cotton into places like Mississippi and Alabama and Georgia and those types of places. When new states joined the Union, slave owners would send a large workforce of enslaved people to clear areas for cotton growth. So Louisiana, Mississippi, Arkansas, Tennessee, as those states become more and more populated or open up to settlement, you would see enslaved individuals go and do most of the work. They would chop down forests, drain swamps, clear and plow the land to plant cotton, to plant food in places like Tennessee, but like predominantly Louisiana and Mississippi. We have that. The idea of yeoman farmers really kind of settling in the South is a myth, right? That was that idea of Jefferson arguing that farmers would settle on land and they would grow everything they needed. Um, the majority of labor is done by the enslaved people, establishing the infrastructure of the South, right? There are yeoman farmers, and the majority of farmers in the South don't own slaves. But still, the common work typically is done by the enslaved. Cotton is very hard on the soil, and so every 10 to 15 years, cotton planters would just simply leave their current location, go somewhere else where they could grow more cotton. All right. Cotton's typically planted in March and April. It's tended to until about August. That's weeding, watering, those types of things. And then in August, the cotton plant would typically bloom with cotton boils. And then at that point, the entire plantation would be called out to harvest the crop, right? A cotton plant can be harvested up to 7 times a season. And so from August until October, picking was pretty regular, right? The average enslaved field worker could pick somewhere in the neighborhood of 200 pounds of cotton per day. If they underachieved, they would typically be beaten, right? Harvested cotton would be run through cotton gins. That originally could start off at 50 pounds per day and then would produce more and more, right? Cotton's then placed on bales and shipped to markets, mostly down the Mississippi River to New Orleans and then out to either the northern industrial cities or to Europe. The Mississippi River is going to take on a greater role because of this cotton market. Steamships are going to carry products and people up and down the rivers. And so you're going to see the birth of towns like St. Louis and Mississippi that are going to be destination spots for travelers and as well for businessmen, right? In 1817, before Missouri is added to the Union, there's only 7 steamships that go up and down the Mississippi River. By 1860, there's over 3,000, right? Cotton and textiles and slave trade all go very much hand in hand. And the labor from enslaved people are going to fuel that economic growth of America in the 1800s, right? In 1807, the United States outlawed the foreign slave trade. We're one of the last countries to do so. So enslaved people can no longer be brought to America for sale, right? Starting in the year 1808. So in 1808, you see the end of the transatlantic slave trade in America. And so after 1808, this is very important. After 1808, the value of enslaved people begins to skyrocket, right? And so you start to see individuals that owned slaves on tobacco farms in places like Maryland or Tennessee or Virginia and Kentucky begin to sell their slaves to new slave owners in the new cotton states in Alabama and Mississippi and so forth and so on because of that increase in value of the enslaved, right? Between 1820 and 1860, almost 250,000 people were bought and sold in American slave markets every 10 years. And so, you do that math, that's almost 1 million people, right? New Orleans was the largest slave market, and Natchez, Mississippi was the second largest seller of slaves. So kind of think about that. Like Mississippi's population, even today, is relatively small. Back then, it was even smaller, but it has the nation's second largest slave market. Okay. The domestic slave trade was the largest forced migration in the history of the United States, forcing enslaved Africans from the upper South, places like Virginia, Maryland, Kentucky, into the deep South, right? By 1860, somewhere about 4 million African Americans are enslaved in America. The South is going to grow cotton that's shipped to northern factories. We've already talked about that. The South also ships the majority of its cotton to England, and the South produces about 80% of the world's cotton. Much of the food consumed in the South is going to be imported either from the American West or from the North. The furniture that's used in the South is going to be typically made in the North. The shoes, the clothing for slaves was produced in the North, unless it was honestly, yeah, probably was produced in the North because slave labor would be instituted, would be more valuable in the production or the harvesting of cotton. Banks in the North loaned money to plantation owners in the South, and so the North is hand in hand with slavery during this time frame. Different ways that the South would try to justify the institution of slavery. is that the is paternalism. This is the idea that slave owners acted in the best interest of their slaves. That the slaves were basically extensions of their family. They were like children that had to be cared for, had to be given food and clothing and religion and all that stuff. The enslaved individuals typically would play dumb or slow down their work um, in rebellions. Acts of they would work slow or they would break tools. In acts of rebellion. Enslaved people would often, be met with threats to either be sold themselves or have their families sold. It's very common for slaves to be beaten or sexually assaulted during this time frame. You're really going to be a slave to the point that they can't work because then you would be taking part of your labor force out of the field. But that threat of physical violence is always going to be there. Marriage between slaves was forbidden by law, but slave owners encouraged some sort of a family commitment for slave families because it was believed that slaves with families were easier to control, that men were less likely to run off if they had families. Some slaves could choose their spouse. Oftentimes, the owners of plantations would choose breeding partners for different slaves. Slave bride and grooms would typically jump a broom as a symbol of their unity, and this is a tradition that's carried on into modern society for some African American newlyweds. Slave owners would select unions, believing that they could produce better slaves. Female slaves were often subject to their master's temperament as far as beatings or even like sexual assault. Slaves didn't have the right to resist their masters. Enslaved parents would teach their kids to be discreet and submissive and guarded. And a lot of the popular slave tales of the day dealt with some sort of like trickster, like Briar Rabbit, who typically would outwit his opponents, right? And we have things like that. Voodoo becomes very popular for lots of the enslaved. Now, voodoo probably wasn't practiced as openly as some historians would like to present it because it would cause the enslavers problems because the whites encouraged Christianity, specifically the parts of the Bible that talked about slavery, right? And we have that, but the enslaved brought to America their understandings of herbal medicines and traditions of healing, right? Location is this is going to be a big part here. Location is going to play an important part of the life of the enslaved. The further north you were, typically the better your treatment would be. Slaves in the Chesapeake Bay areas typically saw work in the tobacco field, which was better treatment than Alabama, where you typically worked in the sugar plantations or the cotton field. People that were enslaved in larger cities were typically treated better than in rural areas. And it's generally believed that the further south an enslaved person was, the worse their treatment. This is due for lots of reasons. The number of slaves on a plantation, the more you have, probably the more that the less personal contact you have with the person that owns you, probably the more mistreatment you might suffer, right? More free blacks people actually lived in the South than in the North. Most of those people are going to stay in the upper South, so Maryland, Virginia, Delaware, those types of areas. One reason for that high population is manumission, in which owners of slaves would free their slaves, and then those former slaves would be free to do what they want. You have the American Revolution saw a large number of manumissions, and then the death of a slave owner was pretty common in those areas for a slave owner to free their slaves upon their death. Right? Freed blacks tended to live in cities in the South. New Orleans had the largest population, we have that. Skin color would play a role in how free blacks were typically treated in society. Typically, the lighter your skin color, the better you were treated. Um, We have that. We have different degrees of quote unquote blackness, and you can read about that in the textbook, right? Free blacks themselves would sometimes own slaves. Um, um, you have that. William Elsman or Elson was a former slave who bought himself and his family's freedom, and then he went on to own slaves and construct cotton gins. And he was one of the largest slave owners in South Carolina. Most freed blacks in the South lived under definitely under the shadow of slavery. They were going to face discrimination. They would see their rights taken away. They couldn't testify against whites in a court. They couldn't seek employment where they pleased. They weren't allowed to own guns. Most of that was because of the fear of slave uprisings, which we'll talk about here in a minute. Treatment of blacks was better, typically better in the upper South than in the deeper South. We talked about that. Um, they believe that historians believe that oftentimes this is because in the Deep South, slavery was profitable. It was seen as a means to money, whereas in the Upper South, slavery was an institution in decline. Right? We talked about slowdowns. Slave uprisings were major slave uprisings were rare because of reprisal and punishments. But slaves did resist almost in every small ways every single day with like work slowdowns or breaking the tools and those types of things. A couple different slave uprisings that we have here. Um, Ones that happened in 1811 is going to be inspired by the slave rebellion in Haiti. And a group of slaves are going to, 500 slaves are going to rebel against a slave owner, kill that slave owner and his son, march on towards New Orleans and Louisiana. They're going to burn multiple plantations. And a militia of white slave owners put down this revolt, right? And so we have that. Um, Pretty typical when you see a slave rebellion led by a slave rebellion led by anybody. The leader of that rebellion, his body's going to be mutilated, um, and and demonstrate and put on public display for others to see. Right. The most famous of the slave revolts, slavery. It should be slavery, not slaver revolts. Slavery revolts was led by Nat Turner. Turner's wife is sold at some point, and Turner has some sort of either epilepsy or some sort of connection to the spiritual realm. And Turner is preaches about the Bible and the use of violence to bring about an end to slavery. And in 1831, he leads a rebellion of slaves that kills 55 white men, women, and children. Um, Ultimately, the rebellion is very short lived. It's only about 48 hours. However, Turner's able to escape, and he lives on the run for a number of different months before he's ultimately captured, drawn, and quartered, and publicly executed. And then we go there. Okay. We've already talked about the international slave market and the end of that. Slave owners coupled enslaved males and females in hope of producing offspring. We've talked about that. 1820 to 1850, the value of enslaved is going to double because of the fact that you can't import new slaves. In 1850, a young, healthy male could be sold for about $1,000, which is roughly about $42,000 in today's money. And so, if you own 10 slaves, that's $500,000. That's a pretty sizable, pretty sizable nest egg you have there, right? Slavery and the white class structure. All right. The cotton boom of the 1800s leads to higher rates per capita of millionaires in Mississippi Valley than anywhere else in the United States. Most of this boom is going to pass by the average person in the South, but a very small percentage of people are going to make lots and lots and lots of money, right? The top of the Southern society is going to be this plainer elite, and they can be divided into really two groups. The first one is going to be old money. This is going to be the gentry from the upper South. This is going to be the traditional tobacco farmers, the people that don't do work. And then you're going to have this new money that's going to come in from the cotton boom, right? And some of these people are going to come from established families that are going to move west, seeking new opportunity. But some of them are just going to be people that kind of just create a new life for themselves, right? This new wealth in the cotton trade are going to be the staunchest defenders of slavery. Planters had enough political power that they could push for foreign and domestic policies, such as the war with Mexico or the Compromise of 1850, and so forth and so on. Yeoman farmers are going to make up this next rung of society. These are farmers that may or may not have owned slaves. It's not typically, if you make a little bit of money as a small farmer in the American South, one of the first things that you're going to do is you're going to buy a domestic slave to help your wife with the household chores, right? And so and then you typically after that you would add a male slave to help with the field work, and then that's probably as far as most of the yeoman farmers that would be slave owners would go. You might have you could have additional slaves at that point. But below the yeomans were the landless whites. This is the majority of the southern population, and these are people that are going to work in various fields or business practices that are going to typically be propped up by the slavery market. This upward mobility is the dream of the landless whites who hope to one day own land and slaves and see that. And so poor whites share this shared with the large slave owner, this common set of values. And this value is going to drive the South is this idea of white supremacy, right? That poor whites accepted this political rule of the plantation owners to ensure that them as being white individuals are going to have a higher place in society. The mudsill theory is a defense of slavery that gets pushed during this time frame. Mudsill basically says that a society requires a lower class to do the essential menial labor of society, and that if that lower class tries to push into the middle class or the upper rings of society, that's where you have issues. Like we go back to Bacon's Rebellion, right, where that lower class demands rights or land, and so slavery, which creates this situation of this lower landless class of people, um, will create a stepping stone for poor whites to maintain their position in society. Okay. The most important thing in the South was to be a gentleman or a lady. If someone called your honor into question, um, it was traditional that you would fight, you would duel, right? Probably the biggest example is John Hammond, who was James Hammond, who was actually the creator of the mudsill theory that we just talked about. And so, interesting story about Hammond is that he became sexually involved with all of his four teenage nieces, and they would write letters back and forth, and he was basically molesting his nieces, right? And Hammond was publicly accused by his brother-in-law, who is the girl's father. Um, and The issue is not that Hammond molested his nieces or that he acted improperly. The issue in the South was that his brother-in-law used the scandal for political gain. Like how he should have handled it was to have gone to Hammond privately, accused him to a duel, and then they would have fought. But because Hammond's brother-in-law went public with it, um, his brother-in-law and those nieces, the girls that were abused, were shamed in Southern society. Hammond went on to become elected senator from South Carolina. He served as governor of South Carolina, and those four girls lived the rest of their life in shame. Right? The South is a patriarchal society in which the men typically run the family. Women are going to serve different roles based on wealth in the plantation families. Women are going to, just kind of be there. They're going to be ornaments. And one of the best things that you can do is marry well, and so families are going to moms of wealthy daughters are going to take kids on traveling tours where they go around and they showcase their daughters in different parties. trying to find the best suitors for them. Okay. Defenses of slavery, you see Mudsill, which we've talked about. You also see this idea of slavery as a moral good. This is an argument that slave owners have that their slaves are actually treated better than the laborers of the North. That if a slave got old or sick, that the slave owner would typically take care of them. Whereas in the northern factories, if you got hurt, then you would just be thrown out. And then you have polyogenius, polyogeniism, in which the idea is that blacks and whites come from different origins, and so therefore, they're not whites and blacks aren't the same, and so therefore, it's not immoral for white people to own black people based on the fact that they're from different races, which of course is not true. But those are some of the defenses of slavery that we have, and that gets us through the antebellum South. We'll talk about some of the changes that will come about in the North and throughout the South with some of the reforms in chapter 13, and then we'll get into 14, 15, 16, which gets us to the Civil War. So we'll see you then. Bye bye.